Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. This is the third of a year-long series of events organized at Harvard by the University Committee on Human Rights Studies on the topic of China as a global player. Future events, which will be publicized like this one was, will include an event on question of Chinese attitude to people with disabilities, an event on the Beijing Olympics and the implications of hosting the Olympics for those interested in rights questions, and possibly an event on police interrogations in China. The huge importance and interest in this topic of political rights in China is, I think, self-evident. But for the purposes of the Human Rights Program here at Harvard, we decided to focus on this issue as a result of the work we did last year on Darfur and on the role of China in Darfur and in Africa. And that was really what prompted us to think that having a broader discussion about Chinese role as a global player in the world was important. And so we've raised a number of questions related to that role of China already. Of course, from a human rights perspective, no question is more central and important than the question of political rights. Many of us who are non-China experts who work in the human rights field witness with growing amazement and concern, perhaps, the mismatch between, on the one hand, this dramatic economic liberalization, the spread, even if uneven, of social and economic rights, the rapid growth of a Chinese middle class, the tremendous expansion of communications and intersections between Chinese public life and the public life within the international community. And yet, on the other hand, we also witness the continued curtailment of most forms of civil and political rights. Perhaps the most extreme examples relate to overt expressions of political opinion which are at odds with the positions of the Chinese leadership, questions related to regional or minority autonomy, the Uyghur question, the question of Tibet, questions related to self-determination, questions related to freedom of expression. But there are, of course, also questions of workers' rights, questions of political corruption and transparency, and even questions of organization around basic issues of access to medical care, accountability within the criminal justice system, many issues which are of great concern. So really the point of this evening is to have a discussion about many of these questions of political freedom and what's going on in China now and what we think the main issues are for the future. The picture is confusing and complex, and we think that as a way of marking Human Rights Day, this is really one of the central issues that we want to address. So we're really delighted that all of you are here with us to do that. And we really intend this evening to be to have as much a component of discussion and question as is possible with three very well-informed speakers. Before I introduce our speakers, however, I want to introduce my colleague Joshua Rubinstein, who is a co-sponsor of this event. He is an expert on one of the other major superpowers, recent superpowers that engaged in curtailments of civil and political rights, namely Russia and the Soviet Union. And he is an expert in particular, on dissidents within the Soviet Union. So he's very well qualified to make a couple of comments about the topic this evening. He's also qualified for another reason, which is he is the regional director for the Northeast of Amnesty International and has been on the staff of Amnesty for over 30 years. And I want to thank Josh for co-sponsoring this event and being here with us this evening. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome everyone. I want to thank Jackie and her colleagues at the University Committee on Human Rights Studies and our colleagues at Facing History and ourselves and other organizations that are joining us this evening to mark Human Rights Day. This is the December 10th, on this coming Monday, will mark the 59th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's important to recognize that a Chinese scholar was very involved in developing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the late 1940s, working with Eleanor Roosevelt at the newly established United Nations. And it's also appropriate, I think, for us to be focusing on China today. China is the most populous country in the world. It will be the focus of a great deal of international attention this coming summer with the Summer Olympics. We all recognize what a dynamic place China is today. Its role in the world, economically and from a military and political point of view, cannot be denied. The question is, how do we integrate China politically to adopt the very values reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? I think this is a challenge that China faces, and it's a challenge that we face in dealing with China. Jackie mentioned, of course, that we're focusing tonight on the curtailment of political rights. And what does that mean? It means that in these months leading up to the Summer Olympics, thousands of people are being rounded up under a program called the re-education through labor. There has been a lot of discussion in China about reforming re-education through labor, but nonetheless, they are invoking this law and this practice to round up people that they feel would be convenient to have off the streets in the months leading up to the Summer Olympics. There's also use of enforced drug rehabilitation, which we feel is being applied in a thoroughly arbitrary way as part of this build-up to the Summer Olympics. But there's also a focus on lawyers, on people who are helping dissidents, raising questions about the raising of housing and neighborhoods in Beijing, also leading up to the Summer Olympics. There are questions about lawyers who have been involved in trying to defend women who have been subjected to undergo forced abortions and sterilization. There's a lawyer named Zheng Guangcheng who has been arrested, who has been beaten. And we wonder why in a civilized society would someone in that kind of position be rounded up and subject to that kind of arbitrary arrest and arbitrary detention. At the same time, in spite of the buildup of communications within China and its obvious connections to the rest of the world, you have this crackdown on domestic journalism, crackdown on people trying to speak their minds through the internet. In the old Soviet days, we had samizdat, where not even that long ago, when people wanted to circulate their views independently, they had to do it on typewriters using carbon paper. And that was the challenge of samizdat. Today, of course, we have fax machines and the internet and email. And so journalists in China have tried to avail themselves of that mechanism. And perhaps the most famous case was one of Xitao, who sent an email in April of 2004, sent an email from his Yahoo account to a US-based pro-democracy website in which he summarized a government order directing media organizations in China to downplay the upcoming 15th anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown. On the basis of this email, police arrested Mr. Xi in November 2004, charging him with illegally providing state secrets to foreign entities. Using his email account holder information supplied by our friends at Yahoo, authorities sentenced Xitao to 10 years in prison in April 2005. He is today being held in a prison in Chengde City in Hunan Province. We have brought appeal letters to Chinese authorities on behalf of Xitao, and they'll be on the table in the back, and we urge you to take copies and send letters. And of course, we have the ongoing problems with activists in Tibet, with people active in the Uyghur province and in the Xinjiang province who are members of the Uyghur ethnic minority. So there are very serious questions in China relating to human rights. And this leads me to my final point. We're all aware, of course, of the domestic angle to human rights issues in China, but China is playing an increasing role in the rest of the world, in Burma, in North Korea, in Darfur. What lever do we have to influence China on this? No Western corporation is going to boycott China. No Western government is going to suggest to boycott China. And at the same time, what levers do we have inside China to press the government on these issues? We know as Americans what kind of challenge it is for us, with the independent voices in Congress, with independent voices in society and journalism, with our ability to have demonstrations, to challenge our government's foreign policy. But what lever is there inside China to influence Chinese foreign policy? And I think for the human rights community, I think for governments around the world, this will become an increasing challenge as China plays a greater and greater role in the international community and, of course, at the United Nations as well. So I think this is an issue that should be in our minds as we listen to our speakers this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to introduce one by one each of our three speakers, and each of them will speak for about between 10 and 15 minutes, and then, as I say, we will have a question and answer period. So our first speaker is Youngjang Lee, who is an alum of Harvard, of the Kennedy School. And he is someone who I think many of you, or several of you in this room, who know and have been involved with, because he was detained by the Chinese authorities and only recently released. He's now the president of the Foundation for China in the 21st Century. And he first came to the US to study for a PhD in 1986. Returned to China in 1989 and was part of the democracy movement and participated in the June the 4th Tiananmen Square uprising. And from what I gather, he decided then to dedicate the rest of his life to the pro-democracy movement, which he will tell you about in a minute. Though he was blacklisted by the Chinese government, he eventually left China and then decided to return to China irregularly in 2002 to work on questions of labor unrest in northeast China. But while he was there, he was detained while trying to board an internal flight, and he was convicted on espionage and illegal border crossing charges in May 2004 and sentenced to 5 years in jail, though he was released after 3 in August 2007. So I'm very delighted to welcome Youngjang Lee here and to ask him to talk briefly about some of his recent experiences as a political dissident in China.
Thank you, Professor Baba. First, I'd like to thank my mentor, Professor Zach Assert, and former President Summers, Dean Elwood, and former Dean Nye, and Professor Baba, and the entire Harvard community for your strong advocacy and efforts to win my freedom today. Thank you very much. In each Sunday service that I have attended since returning to the United States, our priest, Leslie Sterling, says, "Dear brothers and sisters, live without fear." This simple but powerful blessing strikes a resounding chord in my heart. My 5-year imprisonment was a fear-overcoming experience. It deepened my understanding of how fear works to subdue prisoners, and further, how an autocracy, which can be considered a prison at large, employs fear to make people's minds captive minds. I have come to realize that to end a dictatorship, we must begin with efforts to end deep-rooted fear in ourselves and in the people whose freedom we are fighting for. Look at these methods, which the prison authorities applied against me or my inmates: stark naked violence and intimidation of the use of violence, demonstration of omnipotent of arbitrary persecution, degradation and humiliation, isolation, monopolization of perception and brainwashing, harassment and psychological torture, induced debility and exhaustion, occasional indulgence arbitrary intrusion of privacy, and so on and so forth. In the broader sense, the Chinese regime uses the same techniques to create fear and then compliance among the Chinese people. As a result, fear permeates. Everybody under the regime is filled with fear. Fear becomes habit, and habit becomes second nature. Fear is internalized to the degree that people sometimes do not feel fear, but always know how to behave and not cross the lines. A number of recent surveys conducted by foreign scholars revealed, but wrongly, high supporting rates of the Chinese government among the Chinese citizens. The surveys misrepresented the real situation just because the scholars overlooked this very fundamental psychological state of the populace. The Chinese regime is able to continue its rule, not because the Chinese people love autocracy, but because they are trapped in a collective action dilemma because of fear. Collective action dilemma may not be the worst part of the reality in China. Pervasive fear with selective repression and selective indulgence induces cooperation and then voluntary cooperation and finally willing accomplices. It is common in Chinese prisons that prisoners offer help to the guards to repress other inmates, exchanging for favors. Almost every device of torture in prison is invented and made by prisoners. And almost all prison regulations are drafted by prisoners. We see that the Chinese elites have been caught in a situation similar to the prisoner's dilemma, and because of this, the Chinese regime has been able to co-opt them and shore up its power base. A democratic transition in China is most likely to come as a logical result of the growth of the people's democratic forces. But the collective action dilemma and the prisoner's dilemma constitute major hindrances on the road, and the deep-rooted fear is their underlying spell. To break the dilemmas, we must break the spell of fear. I think every fear consists of three components, which I call spiritual fear, material fear, and self-imposed fear. Spiritual fear is fear that can be overcome spiritually by ideas, beliefs, and heroic actions. The leading Chinese Democrats, one generation after another, stood up for their ideas and beliefs. Their heroic actions and ordeals revealed again and again the truth that the biggest fear is fear itself. They have not only morally encouraged many to follow their cause, but also paved the way for their followers to more easily apply the domestic and international pressures that have pushed Chinese regime to make concessions. So we must encourage more heroic actions, promote publicities for them, and propagate their impact on the Chinese society as a whole. I experienced the spiritual fear myself. When the Chinese authority first brought groundless charges against me, I feared that the espionage might tarnish my name, and that I might end up in prison for a long time. But during an interrogation, a police officer, knowing that I was a Christian, asked me to pray for his family and expressed his sympathy to my situation by saying, "A good person like you shouldn't have such a bad future." His words opened my heart and vision. I was innocent, and the Chinese authorities had more fear than I did. They feared my return to China, and they brought a bad name on me because they feared my good name. I was a formidable force to the Chinese autocratic regime. Why should I fear? So I said this in the court: no matter how long I've been sentenced, I will stay in prison until the last day to enjoy the right to move freely in China, my beloved land. I made my words good by rejecting an early release on the condition to leave China right after. I had gradually overcome the fear spiritually and reaffirmed my old belief. Courage is not without fear, but to choose to do the right thing, even with fear. Material fear, the second component of fear, is concrete and can be overcome by external reduction of actual costs. Everybody has a reason to fear because everybody might have something to lose, real or perceived. Again, my experience. When police blindfolded me upon my escorted arriving in Beijing from Kunming, where I had been first detained, fear sent chill to my bones. What are they going to do to me? Are they going to kill me? I began praying to God. I was sent to a nearly 15 months solitary confinement where I was totally cut off from any meaningful human contact and reduced to animal-level physical life, but with tremendous human anxieties. I was forced to sit up and look straight without moving 4 hours each day, and was not allowed to go out for fresh air or sunshine for several stretches, the longest lasting nearly 8 months. Besides, I was constantly subjected to psychological torture inflicted by the interrogators. In the beginning, I was only able to muster courage not to cooperate, but no more. Yet, when I was informed of the outpouring of the support for me from outside, I was greatly encouraged to protest because I knew that I wasn't alone. I wasn't forgotten. And with so many people around the world standing behind me, I could bear the pain. I began to stage the first of a series of protests and successfully ended the forced sitting up practice in the detention center. My experience shows that support from outside world can help reduce the cost of democracy activists may have to face. In fact, the Chinese regime has become increasingly worried about its international image, and your voice can be heard even in Chinese prison cells. And when it is heard, change is quietly made. The third component of fear, self-imposed fear, is self-evident and can be reduced or overcome through education. The climate of tension created by autocratic rulers produces and reproduces fear to the extent that fear itself is a major source of fear. In many cases, risk is much lower than perceived, and fear can be seen as imaginary. For any autocratic ruler, generating self-imposed fear is the most cost-effective way to maintain its rule, and unfortunately, oftentimes, people unwittingly contributed to the consolidation of an autocracy by simply exaggerating its strength and acting accordingly. Much self-imposed fear will be disappeared if the ordinary Chinese people understand that the Chinese regime is on the defense in the battlefield of human rights. The rulers with so many human rights violations have more reasons to fear than we do. The best strategy is to move little by little to touch the boundary of freedom, and little by little push it outward. I believe that we, who enjoy freedom of speech and who stand to incur the least cost, if any, for criticizing autocratic regimes, have the responsibility to help educate the Chinese people by speaking out the truth. But some American scholars have exercised the self-imposed censorship when conducting their China studies and abstained from voicing their views on China. Their messages have been misleading to both the Chinese people and to the international community. They do so out of fear, self-imposed fear. I would have an uneasy feeling if I heard a Harvard professor saying, "I cannot be critical because I want to maintain a good relationship with the Chinese government." During the period of South African people's struggle against apartheid, a great American citizen, Leon Sullivan, authored the Sullivan Principles to help the US business community exercise their collective strength to defend the fundamental values of human dignity. I respectfully suggest that the community of China scholars in the United States should do the same. I received much respect both from inmates and from guards because I'm a Harvard graduate, which placed me in a good position to win them to my side. I respect everybody as a human being and offered them my knowledge and shared with them my ideas and beliefs. When my situation improved, I taught my inmates English, mathematics, economics, logic, and Chinese calligraphy. I also coached a basketball team for 3 years until my last day there. My inmates joined in my work to bring about positive changes in prison, and some guards became my friends. And thanks to their sympathy and protection, I was able to organize a Bible study group. My inmates overcame their fear because they saw me as a protector. They saw some hope. The guards overcame their fear because they saw me as an alternative, and they saw an alternative future. They all began to see that our cause is right and just, and the democracy activists represent a brighter future. I'm going to finish. I'm here today not to tell you why democracy is good and why China needs a democratic order. I believe most of you are democracy lovers and are interested to see democracy take root in China. Instead, I want to share with you my views based on my own experience on how to help the Chinese people and even ourselves reduce or eradicate the deep-rooted fear in the hearts, which is a major obstacle on the road to collective wisdom and collective strength needed for a democratic transition in China. we should openly engage with the Chinese democratic forces, both in and outside China, give them a moral and material support, provide them with ideas and resources, bring their situation to the attention of the international community, speak the truth about China and the world, and provide protection to those in danger. All of these ideas and actions will help reduce the cost of the activists have to face. As fear lessens, more and more people will join the democratic forces. The collective action dilemma will consequently be solved. The growth of democratic forces will go on to help break the prisoner's dilemma because it will provide an alternative future to the Chinese ruling elites who will one after another split from the autocratic regime to join the democratic forces. Who, after all, wants to be on the losing side? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jung Lee. I'm now pleased to introduce Tom Kellogg, our second speaker. Tom is a senior fellow at Yale Law School in the China Law Center and a lecturer at that law school. And he has done research on the rule of law in China and Hong Kong, amongst other topics. He graduated from our law school and has since then written extensively on China, and in particular has written about China's criminal code, arguing that the code itself is an obstacle to effective criminal defense, and that this is a key civil rights issue in contemporary China. He's also done some work on surveillance, including legislative changes in covert surveillance and interception of communications in Hong Kong. And this evening, he's going to talk to us briefly about national and international law as it pertains to China, in particular as it affects questions of political rights. And he's going to comment both on some current concerns, but also on some progress that he can identify in the struggle for political rights in China. Please join me in welcoming Tom Kellogg.
Well, I want to thank Professor Baba and the University Committee for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about the important topic of legal reform, rule of law, and human rights in China. The interesting thing about my job is that I do get to talk to a wide range of actors on the Chinese side, both government, non-government, activist, reformist, conservative, liberal, the wide range of partners that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis as we do our legal reform work gives us some sense of what the different camps on this issue are thinking. And there does seem to be some degree of agreement among all of those camps as to the fact that there aren't any big changes on the horizon in terms of legal reform in China. The government at present is not contemplating any sort of deep-seated institutional reform. It's not contemplating any game-changing moves, again, in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, those different camps, have different opinions as to whether or not a more moderate path is the right approach, but they all do seem to agree that that is the status quo. Now, having said that, there are various, again, positive reforms and areas where there should be more concern that we could highlight, and I'm just going to try to go through those quickly. I guess the area that I would highlight that has seen the most significant area of movement and improvement would be in the area of open government information. As I'm sure many people in this audience know, this past April 2007, the government issued new regulations on open government information that required government bureaus in certain circumstances to issue information when requested by the public. Now, somewhat ironically, it did not actually release those regulations, which made it a little difficult to kind of size up exactly how progressive they were being with that. But we assume that those regulations will be made public relatively soon, or at least by May of 2008 when they go into effect. Another area of positive reform has been on the issue of the death penalty. As of January 1st, 2007, all applications of the death penalty in China have to be reviewed by the Supreme People's Court. This happened on the heels of a series of scandals in which apparently innocent individuals were sentenced to death, and their innocence was then later rather concretely established by further investigation by journalists and others. It does seem that the rate of use of the death penalty in China has slowed since January, although no firm numbers have yet come to light, and it does seem to be the case that the intervention of the Supreme People's Court has meant that there is more uniform application of the death penalty across China. This is an example of a reform that was kind of pushed by both the media and by civil society. I think asking legal reform experts 3 or 5 years ago whether or not there was going to be any movement on the death penalty, the answer would have been a uniform no. And yet the reform pressure generated, again, by some of the media attentions to these cases, meant that the government was sort of nudged to take action, and they did do so. Now, I think I speak for a lot of people in this audience when I say even more progress is needed, and we can look forward to the day when there is no application of the death penalty in China. Obviously, that's not the American government's strongest suit either, but again, we can hope for continued progress in this area. A third area in which there's been some degree of positive reform is in the area of discrimination. This is an area that the China Law Center at Yale has been very heavily focused on. The government has moved relatively quickly after a series of path-breaking lawsuits to strengthen regulations on discrimination on the basis of public health status and discrimination on the basis of gender. Now, of course, discrimination on the basis of race has seen little, if any, progress, but the fact that there has been some progress in those other areas, again, in response to public interest litigation, both says something about the government's willingness to take steps on certain issues at certain times, and the key role that public interest litigation can play, public interest lawyers can play, in pushing forward the cause of legal reform in China. If I can throw out one economic, social, and cultural rights point, there has been increased attention by the government to delivering social goods and services to the poorest of the poor in China. This is the so-called harmonious society slogan that Hu Jintao is so fond of reciting. That, while it does, of course, sound like political propaganda, and often is, has achieved real results in terms of delivering economic and public health services to especially rural populations. So that is the positive side of the ledger, at least as I see it. On the negative side, I think it is probably fair to say that on the criminal law issue, there has been only limited progress. And speaking to lawyers who handle criminal cases, they uniformly tell us that even the most basic due process rights in the criminal process that are in the Chinese Criminal Procedure Code are still not adhered to in case after case. The ability of lawyers to meet with their clients immediately after arrest, the ability of lawyers to gather evidence in a particular case, intimidation of witnesses for the accused, and direct pressure on lawyers who are handling these cases all are very much routine in criminal law cases at present. It does seem to be the case that there will be some modest reforms enacted when the Criminal Procedure Code comes up for review next year, and that, of course, is good. But the general concern among people who follow this area closely is that it won't be enough to kind of fully balance out the two sides of the ledger as it terms to the power of the state and the power of the accused or the individual defense lawyer working on his behalf. Another area in which there could be more progress made is the issue of media regulation. Now, one could argue that there's been a lot of progress on the issue of free expression in China over the past 5 to 10 years. All of that progress has taken place in the absence of any legal change. That is to say that progress has taken place because the media has marketized. Progress has taken place because there are now, in any given city, 5 or 10 newspapers or even more, as opposed to the old 1 or 2. Now, that diversity of voices and that growing number of journalists who have the skills to tell compelling stories about important issues, That is progress. But those journalists generally work in the complete absence of any legal framework that will protect their right to free expression if and when they get in trouble. Anecdotally speaking, there does seem to be an increase in threats of violence and actual violence against journalists. This is an extremely concerning trend for those of us who follow human rights and the rule of law in China. One example, in January 2007, a Chinese journalist named Lan Changzheng was beaten to death by thugs hired by a coal mining concern that he was investigating on alleged corruption charges. One slight positive area on the free expression front is that there does seem to be some progress on the issue of defamation, in which defamation defendants are more able to avail themselves of the courts and to get a better trial, I won't say a fair trial, on the issue of defamation, even against state actors, than they were, again, 10 years ago. This is limited progress, but this progress has not been codified in the law, and there has been no actual concrete legal change in this area. So this is another area of concern in my view. Last but not least of the areas of concern, I would say, is institutional reform. It does seem that there's been a hesitancy of the government and the party to enact the kind of wide-ranging institutional reforms that are needed, for the full creation of a system ruled by law. You can't have a rule of law state without an independent judiciary. You can't have a rule of law state without the separation of party and government functions. You can't have an effective anti-corruption campaign without a truly independent anti-corruption body within the government. These kinds of issues have plagued legal reform in China for decades now, since the beginning of the reform and opening era. And it seems that, at least from the people that I've been speaking to over the past couple of months, that there's an increasing pessimism on this issue in particular, and the willingness of the central government to engage in the kind of power-limiting reforms that would be necessary to create a truly independent judiciary, to create a truly functioning legislature, the one that is, again, able to actually vote down certain proposals from the executive. Those kinds of steps don't seem to be on the horizon, and yet one might argue that they are exactly what China needs at this juncture. Just a couple of points in conclusion. That attitude of pessimism on institutional reform was reflected among a wide range of actors that I spoke to on my last trip to Beijing. There seems to be growing skepticism and doubt among a lot of key actors about the government's degree of commitment to legal reform, despite the fact that so much progress has been made over the past 20 years. You can contrast this degree of skepticism to the feeling that a lot of these folks had in around 2002, 2003. I think at that moment there was a degree of, again, optimism. There was a feeling that the government was going to take the steps necessary to take legal reform to the next level. There were some signals out there. Hu Jintao then just kind of consolidating his role as the top leader within the power structure, gave a very progressive speech on the 20th anniversary of the new Chinese constitution. This is reaching back to 2002. The appointment of Xiaoyong to the Supreme People's Court and the reforms that he enacted over his tenure were again seen by many as a signal that the government was serious about legal reform. A lot of people no longer hold that view, and they're just the kind of people, elite university professors, elite journalists, even government officials, whom are very much whose support and confidence the government needs. If I was going to make a policy recommendation to the government, I would ask them to really reach out to these people and say to them, what do we need to be doing right now? And they would get a laundry list that was very different from the current agenda that they have. In conclusion, I think that the current pessimistic attitude perhaps indicates to us that legal reform in China, at least over the next 3 to 5 years, is going to be much more of a bottom-up process than a top-down one. That has implications for legal reform groups like the China Law Center. I think it has some implications for international human rights groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. And I hope in the Q&A we can get into that issue a little bit more. So thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Professor Merle Goldman, who is a Professor Emerita of History at BU and a Research Associate here at the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research at Harvard, where she received her PhD in History and Far Eastern Languages. She has a long scholarly career, much of which has been dedicated to the study and the documentation of different aspects of political dissent in China. Most recently, she has written a book called From Comrade to Citizen, The Struggle for Political Rights in China, published by Harvard in 2005. This book documents the history of political organizing and the rise of a democracy movement over the last 2 decades. And she documents the growth of a movement from a limitation focused on urban intellectuals to a much broader movement encompassing peasants and workers as well, hence the title of her book, the idea that it is not simply, people are no longer thinking of themselves simply as comrades, but as citizens in a broader China. She's going to comment briefly on the situation of political rights in China today and set out in the context of the general political situation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Goldman.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that today's China is not the China of Mao Zedong. During the Mao era, from 1949 to 1976, whole groups of people were persecuted and imprisoned, not so much for what they said or for what they did, but for who they were. Therefore, in 1957, Mao launched a massive campaign against intellectuals. It was called the Anti-Rightist Campaign, in which 700,000 intellectuals were persecuted just for what they were. In the late 1950s, Mao launched the campaign called the Great Leap Forward, in which he attempted to transform China into a communist state, literally overnight, in which 30 million people lost their lives. And then, of course, there was the great proletarian cultural revolution, in which Mao turned against his own party, who he thought were conspiring against him. And it was a massive campaign that led to chaos, disorder, and anarchy, and did not end until his death in 1976. What we have in the post-Mao era, led by his old comrade, Deng Xiaoping, who was on the Long March with Mao, is something, I can't say it's different. It is still, the Communist Party is still in control. It is an authoritarian state, but I guess it is not what you would call a totalitarian state. Deng Xiaoping and his followers opened up the economy, led to a market economy, opened China up to the outside world, allowed freedom in one's personal life, one's academic life, and an artistic life. So that there's much more personal freedom, more economic freedom. There is not, as you can see, much political freedom. Nevertheless, within this atmosphere, there have been several movements to assert political rights. And as Jackie says, that is the topic of my book, From Comrade to Citizen. And the first movement that occurred was in the late 1970s, shortly after Mao's death. And this was led by a group of ex-Red Guards. If you remember, in the Cultural Revolution, Mao mobilized the young people to rebel against authority, rebel against their families, rebel against the party. They caused chaos. They were sent to the countryside. And in the countryside, away from their families, away from authority, away from the party, they began to form their own groups, began to read books on their own, began to have their own discussions. And they began to question the political system. So that after Mao's death, when they returned back to the urban areas, back to the cities, they launched something called the Democracy Wall Movement. It began in Beijing, but it spread to virtually every large city in China. And these were ex-Red Guards coming back, using the techniques they had used in the Cultural Revolution, wall posters, debates, publishing their own pamphlets. They called for economic reforms, which was in line with what Deng Xiaoping called for, but they also called for political reforms. And this movement as I said, spread, and as it spread to other territories, as it began to enlarge, Deng Xiaoping cracked down on it. So that was the first movement to assert political rights in China. And then the next important movement, of course, is one I think most of you know about, and that was in 1989, when the students in the university area in Beijing led a march to Tiananmen Square, which is the center of the government, demanding political rights. This became a nationwide movement again, spreading to all the major cities in China. Now, what made this movement different is because for the first time, you begin to see non-intellectuals, non-students join the movement. You began ordinary citizens join this movement, workers join this movement, and at first, the students attempted to keep the workers out because they knew the one thing that really frightened the Deng Xiaoping leadership was a combination of workers and intellectuals in the form of the Solidarity movement that occurred in Poland in 1980, which really was the beginning of the end of what we would call the Soviet Empire. And so at first they try to keep the workers out, but the workers pushed themselves in. Ordinary citizens pushed themselves into the movement and became a citywide and a nationwide movement. As this movement spread, as the students some began to turn against Deng himself and say, down with Deng Xiaoping. The leadership, especially the old party leaders, became frightened. They thought this is another cultural revolution. And as many of you know, Mao then sent in the troops on June the 4th, 1989, and Deng sent in the troops on June 4th, 1989, and crushed this movement. However, the efforts to carry out some kind of political struggle have continued after June the 4th. For example, in 1998, there was an effort to establish an opposition political party. It was called the China Democracy Party. And it's very interesting. The leaders of this party were the veterans of the Democracy Wall movement and the 1989 movement. They had been imprisoned, but due to pressure from the outside world, the leaders had been released from prison. Also, they had been released from prison because China wanted to hold the Olympics in 2008. They tried for an earlier time, they didn't get it, but they got the 2008. So there was this effort to try to conform to certain standards in the outside world, so that these were the leaders of this effort to build a opposition political party. And it began locally. It was in the city of Wuhan, but spread very, very quickly. And they did it in a very, I think, ingenious way. They set up the China's democracy movement as an NGO. NGOs now are very prevalent in China. You can set up NGOs. They registered it at a local office of the Ministry of Civil Affairs and as an NGO. And then it began to spread. It spread to the Northeast, to Manchuria, to Shanghai, to Chongqing. In other words, it became a nationwide movement. And a lot of the planning, a lot of the connections, the way in which they carried it out was through the internet. So obviously, use of the internet, use of cell phones were a very important part in the ability to get this movement off the ground. And it is for those reasons, of course, that China attempts to filter and censor the internet. They got it off the ground. It lasted for almost 8 months, and then, of course, it was crushed, and their leaders were in prison once again. So what do we make from all of these efforts? And there are many others as well. And what does it really mean? That China, certainly it is possible to attempt to express your political rights. The problem is it's very difficult to achieve those political rights. In other words, you can get the movement off the ground, but when you begin to threaten the government politically, then they will crash down. There is a very important factor here, and we haven't really discussed it up to this point, is the impact of the outside world. Mao didn't care what the rest of the world thought of China. But these leaders do care. They want to become respected members in the outside world. They don't want to be denounced as abusers of human rights, even though certainly they are. And they attempt at least to keep up the front of being part of this respected community. And they have signed the UN Covenant on Social and Economic Rights in 1997. They have signed the UN Covenant on Political and Civil Rights in 1998. China's rubber stamp Congress has passed the first covenant on economic and social rights, but it has not passed the one on political and civil rights. Nonetheless, the very fact that they had signed those covenants means that people demanding their rights can point to this covenant, to the fact that China signed them, as a basis for the legitimacy of their actions. It's very similar to what we saw in the former Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union signed on to the Helsinki Accords. The dissidents in the Soviet Union pointed to those accords as evidence, as the basis, legal basis for their actions. So what do we say? Is it glass half empty or half full? It's very difficult to say. All we can say is that there are people, there are groups, there are individuals that are attempting to assert their political rights in China, are attempting to use China's desire to be accepted in the international community to make China live up to those covenants which they signed. And it is certainly, they have not been successful. But what really, I guess I end my book on a hopeful note, is that these efforts to try to assert their rights. And let me end perhaps with one of the major, I think, social changes that I think has happened in the post-Mao period, and that is the development of a middle class in China, with growth at 9 to 10% a year for almost 30 years. China has developed developing a large middle class, but it is not what we would call a bourgeoisie. It is not an independent middle class. It's a class that has been very tied in with the party. To get their opportunities in the economy, they have to have connections in the party. They want to become members of the party. But there are other members of this middle class. The defense lawyers. China never had defense lawyers. Today they have defense lawyers. Very, very important. Journalists who go and report on abuses of human rights. When villagers rebel against their village headman because they think he's corrupt, the journalists will go down and write about it, take pictures about it, and they make this public. And public intellectuals who will speak out on these issues, and some of them are detained, some of them are in prison, but they continued once they're released to speak out. So that you have a new, I believe, a whole new class of people developing in China who are joining for the first time with ordinary people in their political protests, and at the same time, I think, having an impact on China's political system. So on that note, I will end with an optimism.
Thank you. So thank you all very much for your comments, and I'm now happy to take questions, and if you wouldn't mind lining up or going to the mics and saying your name and your affiliation, please. So, yeah, Sam.
Hi, my name is Alan Zhao, and I'm a first year at the business school. So I want to thank our guests for speaking here tonight and sharing your experiences and your research. So a couple questions, if I may. Given that modern China has only seen 50 years of history, 50 or 57 years of history, and it is still growing, and much can be said about progress being real, but at a slow pace. And this is something that I want to pose to Mr. Yang. You know, you talked about your vision of democracy for China, but democracy means different things for different countries. So can you just kind of elaborate on, you know, what is your vision of democracy, how it works, and what are the conditions that needs to be met for China to actually to fulfill that?
Do you want to ask your second question, and then you can sit down?
The second question is, given my focus, I'm a business school student, is the battle towards democracy an entirely legal battle? And what do you guys see the role of economics and large corporations?
Okay, so who would like to answer that? Jung Lee, do you want to start? Oh, Merle?
Well, they're talking about, if I understand your question, what can we say about China moving towards a democracy? Is that your question? I don't understand.
My
What
question
conception
is,
of democracy do we have, and what's the role of economic forces in creating or pushing towards Chinese democracy? Do you want to start maybe?
Let me answer
Yeah.
the question
I
you
understand.
raised to me. And we Chinese care too much about the Chinese characteristics for everything. We fear to lose our identity in all kinds of activities and construction of a new system. So I don't think we should worry about that. Everything grows up in China will have the characteristics of China, the Chinese characteristics. And what democracy in my mind? Democracy is democracy. It has to be democracy. It must satisfy the widely accepted several principles: free, fair, competitive elections of government of all levels, freedom of speech, and the freedom of press, and protection of human rights. I think that's the basics. A rule of law, of course. And, the thing is, there are all kinds of democracies, all types of democracies that we have seen in the world existing. But an apple has to be an apple. You just cannot say, oh, this is, when you take an orange, you say, this is an apple of Chinese characteristics. That doesn't work.
Does anybody else want to say something? Yeah.
Let me just say,
Jump in too.
if you were to look at the other post-Confucian countries, at South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, they're all democracies. They were one of the first democracies in the non-Western world. So there's very clear that there is nothing in China's tradition, or very little in China's tradition, that would hinder China from moving towards a democracy. That's one thing. If you look at the way it developed in Taiwan, it really came up from below. It was really pressure coming from below. At this point, there isn't that kind of pressure yet. You saw those movements I described to you, the Democracy Wall, Tiananmen Square. But those were students, it wasn't really coming from below. Today, China has, and I guess, I don't know if you really call this democracy, they can vote for their village heads and their village councils. And I've been a part of the group that's monitored. Those are real elections, though usually it's a party head that wins, that becomes the village head. But at least they're beginning to vote. And the peasants are beginning to express their discontent if they're not happy with the way the village head is acting. That is the reason for so many of these protests that are going on all over China. In 2005, it's estimated there were 87,000 protests in China. Most of those were coming from the countryside, from the peasants. So it seems to me when you talk about democracy, it's going to be slow, it's going to be gradual, and it's going to come from below. And then you will get, hopefully, some leadership on top, but once that comes up, will recognize what's happened and say, okay, we have a democracy.
Tom.
Yeah, on your second question, I think one of the regrettable outcomes of the debate in the United States over U.S.-China policy in the 1990s was that there was this oppositional kind of situation set up between the business community and the human rights community. And the suggestion was the business community wants trade with China, the human rights community does not. In fact, the picture was actually much more complex than that. That impression, I think, has lingered. However, if you look at the situation today, it would seem to me, anyway, that one of the key beneficiaries of increased rule of law in China would be the business community. If you look at the toy scandals, if you look at the food safety scandals, if you look at the number of American corporations that took a big hit because they produced in China, because China was, and then it was found out that their products were unsafe, the Chinese government was not enforcing their own food safety standards, their own occupational safety standards, their own product safety standards. Of course, the main losers in that game are the Chinese consumers, but this then has a spillover effect both to American consumers and to American companies that produce there. even in sort of taking one step back and kind of looking at the overall system-wide effect, to the extent that Chinese courts do a better job at enforcing legal norms, American companies that have a contractual dispute with their Chinese partner that have to go to court benefit. Now there are concerns, Jerry Cohen has a great article about concerns about the independence of the Chinese arbitration system. This, for years, was looked at as the way to go in China because the courts weren't strong enough. Well, if we have our arbitration clause in our contract with our Chinese partner, we'll be okay. Now concerns are being raised about that. So I think that, not to oversimplify the issue, but there is, for the business community, a real interest in seeing a more aggressive approach to the development of the rule of law in China. And if they can start to be a little more creative in finding ways to push forward that agenda, I think they may be helped by that.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tarun Singh. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming here and speaking to us today. And my question is for Professor Kellogg, and specifically referring to, you referred to it a little bit when you were speaking about the United States' imperfections, especially with the death penalty, with NSA wiretapping, and Guantanamo Bay. How do we reconcile these faults of our own and being able to still, on a governmental level, ask China to reform themselves when the world community is saying that we lack legitimacy ourselves? How do we say, well, we're still a lot better?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a great point, and I think that for the U.S. government officials whose job it is to go there, their job just got a lot tougher. Because their Chinese interlocutors are good at their job and they're tough. I've met with these people on the Chinese side, they are good. They will know these things, they will bring these things out. And finding a way to have that conversation constructively will be difficult. It even has a spillover effect for folks like us who are on the non-governmental side of things. Chinese colleagues will say to us, what right do we have to say you should do X, Y, or Z when the US government is doing A, B, and C? My response to that is to say, there is no country in the world that has a perfectly clean human rights record, and I think the cost that the U.S. government has incurred with some of the choices that it has made, it kind of demonstrates, even more compellingly, why certain reforms are beneficial to the government that undertakes them. I would say, just if I can throw in one more point, sort of related to your question, I think the current dynamic also behooves both those of us in the rule of law side of things and those of us on the human rights side of things to try to think of new strategies to engage China on these human rights issues. Because the temptation, when I was in the human rights community, the temptation was always say, if we can just get the US government to push harder on this, then China will make the change because the relationship is so close and all the rest of it. That, I am sensing that whenever that stopped being the case, it's difficult to say. I'm not sure that it is particularly the case at this moment in time. And I think that the human rights community in particular has been a little bit slow to trying to think of alternative strategies to advance the cause of human rights in China, and some thinking in that area would be appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I would like to thank all the speakers for coming to speak today. My name is Quinny Lin. I'm class of 2009 at Harvard College. And my question is, given that all three speakers have commented on the fact that democracy and political freedom starts from the bottom up, I think that that struggle from the bottom up is very related to the education system in China. And I was wondering if any of you can comment on the development and reform in the education system as related to the nurturing of political rights and democracy in China.
Thank you. Who'd like to answer that question?
You want to go first, Merle? You want to go first?
Yeah. I'm not sure that there is what you call an education movement on political rights in China, if that's what you were saying. They talk about political rights, but I think there's very little understanding at this point about what political rights really are. So the people who talk about political rights are the people I mentioned, people who have suffered from political oppression. But so far, they've invited people over to come and give talks on human rights in China and so forth. But I just wonder, it doesn't penetrate very far.
Can I do 2 sentences on that? I might disagree with Merle a little bit, at least on the law school front. I'm certainly not qualified to speak outside the legal education sector. But at the very least, and especially in elite universities in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, there is a degree of penetration of advanced legal thought, more of a comparative approach, an approach to, again, looking at questions of law from a diversity of comparative theoretical perspectives rather than just the old Marxist approach. And there is now a rich body of literature, both in translation and developed by Chinese scholars, trying to think through all of the legal reform problems that China is facing. One problem is that all these people who are getting these great educations in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, their professional choices after that raise some important dilemmas. If you are a graduate of Beijing University and you can, from the law school, and you can take a job paying a lot of money for an elite Western law firm, or you can bang your head against the wall at a local government office where you could also get a job and perhaps achieve a tiny little bit of incremental change, which might you take? Obviously graduates of this university face similar questions about what they want to do with their lives, and they are not unfamiliar with these kinds of questions. But kind of finding a way, I guess what I would say is if the Chinese government needs to be aware of this dynamic, it needs to encourage their students to do the kinds of things that they need to have done.
Let me just modify what I said, because I would agree with Tom on that. But what I have seen, and what I wrote about actually in the book, is the concept of rights has really gone down to, it's spread in the population. I'm not sure they understand it quite completely, but it's certainly that concept is there. In fact, I witnessed a demonstration on the outskirts of Xi'an where peasants were holding up wall posters, and they were protesting that their land had been taken away, and they said, they used the term, give me back our rights, give us back our rights. So that concept is there. What exactly, how they interpret it is not clear, but certainly that concept has spread.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So,
One second.
Next question.
maybe next question.
Okay, sure. Yeah, madam. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Chuan Qing. I'm a reporter from the Epoch Times newspaper, also known in Chinese as 大纪元时报. I'm very glad to hear so many wonderful insights about China issues. And I also want to bring your attention to another major movement occurring now in China. As a major Chinese media, we take our responsibility very seriously, like let the truth be known and let a voice be heard. So 3 years ago, in December 2004, our newspaper has published a series of comments on the Chinese Communist Party, known as 9 Commentaries on the Chinese Communist Party. Since its publication, over 30 million people, Chinese people, has made public announcement to quit the Chinese Communist Party and its associated organization. I think it's an evidence that more and more people are overcoming the fear that Dr. Yang has mentioned and try to use nonviolent method to disintegrate tyranny in China. Yeah, education is important, and I thank you all for that.
Thank you. Does anybody want to make a comment?
I just want to follow up the previous
Go ahead,
question.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Yeah. And as far as I know, there is no textbook contains the content of political rights for elementary, secondary, and high school education. Mm-hmm. There are something about political rights for the universities, but there is no textbook specifically designed to promote the awareness of the political rights of the students. That's as far as I know. And instead, in some of their textbooks for elementary and secondary education, they contain the theory of Deng's theory, the Marxism, Leninism, and the Mao Zedong thoughts. And the 3 represents theory initiated by Jung Lee, and maybe now included into the harmonious society and the scientific development view, things like that. And also in the Chinese textbooks, there are a lot of distorted historical facts, which will pose a serious problem to the generations to come. So that's my comment.
Thank you. So we have the two last questions. Yes, sir.
Jed Schwartz, also known as Jed Sampson. So occurred to me when the Chavez election was happening just this week that the sort of flaw in the ointment of Marxist theory is that the state will wither, that the dictatorship of the proletariat will dissolve and wither into some kind of democratic entity. Because it seems to me that especially in China, you have sort of a dictatorship for life. Yeah? Is Deng still there? Did he die?
He died.
He died. But I mean, typically in the Soviet Union, we always said, well, they messed it all up, you know? But it seems to me that you have these guys who are appointed supreme leader for life, and they have every interest in staying supreme leader until they die. And then the next one has the same interest. So the question is in China, is this even more so given the Confucian cultural antecedents?
Thank you.
Let me just say that I don't think anyone today really believes in Marxism, Leninism. That whole ideology has become bankrupt. It doesn't really compel anyone in China. So then what is taking their place? What is happening? And there's been a rise in religion, various religions, not only Buddhism and Taoism, but Christianity. And there has been, the present leadership has revived various Confucian values. It talks about harmony. It talks about harmony. It's certainly an authoritarian form of harmony. But the point is that to fill that vacuum, it's very difficult at this point. So I don't think there's any belief system that permeates this society today.
We'll take the last two questions together, and then we'll give the panelists a final chance to make their closing remarks. Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Valerie Epps, and I teach international law at Suffolk Law School. And, but in the spring of 2006, I taught human rights and international law at Fudan University in Shanghai. So I had an opportunity to both think about human rights in the Chinese context and also observe them. And I think, as has been noted here by many people, China is probably going through the fastest change, scope and speed of change in China on all levels is probably something that's never occurred in history before. And I think many people have noted that at least since about 1980, there's been much progress on a number of fronts in terms of various human rights, such as religious freedom, such as access to health care, such as access to education, such as, I mean, coming right down to law schools, since 1980, over 500 law schools have been established and so on. So all of this is going on, as well as the massive economic changes that have occurred in this time. Also, I think one should say, though I don't necessarily want to get into a contrasting with the American experience, but there's a very low crime rate in China, and one can walk about anywhere at any time of night and feel perfectly safe in China, which is certainly not true for most Western countries and particularly for the United States. So I guess my question is this: does the panel see all of these rights, the economic, social, cultural, political, and civil, as bound up together and as likely to progress at roughly the same level and at the same rate? Or do they think that for some reason or another, the economic, social, and cultural rights will keep coming up, but that the civil and political rights will not go at the same right? Are they bound together or are they separate?
Thank you. Okay, well, if you'll hold Professor Epps' question in your mind, and we'll have the last question.
My name is Metrus Umbeidullah. I'm Scholar at Risk Fellow at Harvard. I'm hosted by Anthropology Department. September 11, after September 11, Chinese government used war on terror against Uyghur self-determination and freedom of speech, and legitimized execution in East Turkestan. So my question is Turkestan cause is not known and not get support from West, like Tibet? How we can publicize our cause? Second question, how is the Chinese regional ethnic autonomy law implemented in China? Does it protect minority rights? Thank you.
Okay, so we have three questions on the table. One about whether civil and political and economic, social, and cultural rights are going to go in parallel or divergent. Secondly, what the strategies might be for drawing attention to the Uyghur sort of struggle and making it as well publicized or well known as the Tibetan struggle, for example. And thirdly, the extent to which non-discrimination provisions actually protect minority and semi-autonomous regions in China. So maybe we'll start with Jung Lee, and we'll just walk across the panel and use that also as a way of concluding our event.
Okay. So based on my experience, a 4 months experience after I was released, I stayed in China for 4 months before I finally came back to the United States. So I saw that people generally enjoy greater personal liberties in China, much, much greater than it used to be maybe 5 or 7 years ago when I went back to China. But the problem is the field of political right is still tightly controlled. And there are two mentalities inside the party, the ruling party. One is to open up, to raise the level of political rights to the level of to the personal liberties. But the other mentality is to bring down the level of personal liberty that people are enjoying to the level of political rights. Because the gap, long-existing gap, will pose a problem to the current regime. It will create a chaotic situation in China, unrest. So the two mentalities and the two policies are actually working within the system. That's why we often see mixed signals, mixed policies. So China is a police state. So it has 460,000 police force. So it has ability to crack down any unrest if they are determined to. So the time is very critical right now, because recently, simply because of the enlarged the political space, public political space, the personal liberties people are enjoying simply because of that. So many people are demanding the political rights, and even the people inside the party system recently, one after another, wrote open letters to the top leaders asking for the open up of political rights. So I agree with you, China is going to have a big thing to happen. And I think the key thing here is the democratic forces in China. The question I will always think is how to help the growth, help the democratic forces in China to grow. Because we often talk about the prerequisites for democratization in China. We talk about economic conditions, cultural conditions, and all the other conditions. but there is one condition which is necessary, that is the growth of democratic forces in China. So that's the key issue.
On the question, the sort of in tandem or civil and political rights question, I think that the conventional wisdom is that economic, social, cultural rights in China have sort of gone like this between 1980 and 2007, and that the civil and political has gone like this, sort of also a positive trend, but a much slower growth rate. I would complexify that a little bit. For example, on the economic, social, cultural rights front, obviously there are more hospitals in China, there are better hospitals in China, there's more access to drugs, there's more access to modern medical techniques, but only if you're in a certain segment of the population. And whereas before, if you were a poor villager, you had at least the state-guaranteed health care, not just for you, but for your family and for the entire village, and there was no feeling that you were being left behind. The marketization of the healthcare system means that, again, from an individual perspective, there may be a questioning of this, sort of dynamic path, and perhaps not completely unlike the marketized system in the United States. On the civil and political front, certainly if you take 1976 as your sort of point of comparison compared to today, again, it's sort of perhaps, an easy answer to say, well, not so good then, very good now. But if you compare 1986 to 2007, in terms of the dynamic and robust discussions that were going on at that time on civil and political reform, on whether or not the party should in fact recede from the government structure, none of those conversations are taking place today. Yet we do have a marketized media today, yet we do have, we have the internet, we have a number of different voices that are out there. So I guess I would just point to the complexity of the question as, sort of a subject for debate rather than providing any easy answers. I don't know if that responds to.
And I would like to just add to what both of the speakers talked about. The Chinese, I think, believed, at least in the 1980s, they had economic and social rights. What happened with the reforms the economic reforms, is it has led to increasing inequalities, not only between classes, but between areas. So that, as the other speaker said, people have lost their rights to a universal health system, for example. Very, very important. They've lost their pensions. There are strikes, there were major strikes that went on for 6 weeks up in China's northeast several factories in 3 major cities protesting against the loss of health care, the loss of their pensions. And so I believe that they might have thought they had their economic rights, but they no longer feel that anymore. So that is really gone, and most Chinese would say what's gone in a negative direction. As for political rights, my colleagues who I've interviewed tell me that in the late 1990s, they felt they had more space for political discourse than they do today, that it has not been a progressive movement, and it's moved back and forth, and that they really feel cut off. So has there been progress? Yes, there has been progress, certainly if you compare the post-Mao era to the Mao era. I would agree with Tom. The 1980s was a period when they talked about political reform. The major forces who talked about it, the people that Deng Xiaoping, who he made the head of the party, were purged because they talked about political reforms. So it's not going to be in a straight line. And progress is certainly not going in a straight line. In fact, I would say in some ways it's gone backwards. Now, I will say this for the present leadership. It is attempting to do something about the economic inequalities. It is attempting to try to establish a healthcare system for the countryside. It is trying to help with the education in the countryside. So far, it hasn't materialized, but it could. So it's really a mixed picture. And if you say, what period would you have liked to live in China in the post-Mao era, I'd say I prefer the 1980s.
Would anybody like to say anything about the minorities question, about the Uyghurs?
Yes, I'm sorry, the Uyghurs.
Do you want to, should we go back in this way?
Or maybe just one comment, unless there's a burning comment.
We took a trip to Xinjiang, was it last year? It was last year, yes. And we went to the capital city, Urumqi, which is now being filled with Chinese Han merchants, and it's almost like a Chinese city. We just go a little further out to Kashgar, and you then, that's Uyghur city, and it's just totally different. And there's seems to be very little change there. So I think this is a very difficult problem that the Chinese government does not, fears an independent Uyghur state. They call it East Turkestan. They crack down very heavily on any effort to assert their autonomy or independence. And they are sending, or just millions of Han merchants are coming in to Xinjiang as they are into Tibet. And it could be in time that the numbers will just be overwhelmed by Han Chinese. So I think this is a very difficult problem, and I have yet to see any policies to really deal with it.
It does seem remarkable that, for example, executions are taking place which the international community is hardly paying attention to, and that there is large-scale arrest and detention of activists. So these are obviously really serious human rights issues. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly undeniable that Xinjiang and Tibet are two of the most grave and serious human rights concerns in China today. If I could, sort of take a slightly different, having acknowledged that, if I could take a slightly different angle on the question to say that I've been surprised in recent years talking to various Chinese interlocutors, sort of, after the interview's over and the notebook is closed, the number of Chinese intellectuals that I've talked to that have this intense interest, cultural interest in Tibet. And they want to go there the way that, oftentimes Americans want to go there, and they're very curious about it. And they have this intellectual curiosity about it that's very divorced from the Chinese government policy toward it. There's no similar degree of curiosity about Xinjiang. And to the extent that that curiosity could be fostered among intellectuals and elites, again, over a 10 to 20 to 30-year time frame, that strategy of greater understanding could pay some modest dividends.
Well, just before I thank my speakers, I would just like to say that there is a sign-up sheet for any of you who would like to get information about other human rights events at Harvard organized or coordinated through the University Committee. So please do sign up. And please join me in thanking our three speakers for very enlightening talks. Thank you very much.